5 years ago, an unarmed 18-year-old black teenager named Mike Brown was shot and killed by a police officer named Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. His death and the protests surrounding it catapulted police brutality into the national spotlight and had a lot of Americans thinking, do Black lives even matter? I'm Jessica Mooley, and joining me today to discuss where we are as a nation and as a people 5 years after Ferguson, Ellie Mistel, executive editor of Above the Law, Shavonna Newsom, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Greater New York, and David Johns, executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Where were you when you found out about the death of Mike Brown in 2014?
Well, I had just moved into my house in the suburbs, and so I was not even watching the news. I think I was outside with my kids. My mom lives with us, and she saw it on the news, and so she called me, and she was like, they shot another one. And I was like, okay, that happens, right? Like, that's not surprising. And then she's like, no, you got to see this because people are actually pissed off. And I was like, oh. And then it kind of occurred to me like, oh, they actually are putting this on the news. They usually don't put this on the news. They usually don't care when, this happens so often in our communities. They usually don't care when it happens. So the fact that it was even on the news actually is what made news to me in my household. So then I came down and I saw it, and the first clip I saw was really them leaving his body in the street. And that was the kind of visceral, like, look at how much they don't care. They didn't even bother to cart away the body.
I was scrolling Instagram, like most breaking news, like Baller Alert or The Shade Room or something like that. I get like my social media and I get like my political stuff is all kind of on my timeline, and I saw it there first. I was outraged, like with Trayvon not happening not so long ago, the outrage and how they were trying to paint him in the picture. I was taken aback and hurt at the same time.
I was serving our country and still my president, Barack Hussein Obama, leading an initiative that he established to focus on educational excellence for African Americans. And we had planned a series of events. Some of them had to do with My Brother's Keeper initiative that had a lot to do with conversations we were having about Trayvon Martin. And a lot of people might recall the moment when President Obama said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. Trayvon would look like me. And so I very much remember grappling with having planned a series of events, one of them in Florissant, that was supposed to be a couple of weeks after this happened, and literally sitting in my office and sobbing, thinking about how many more times this would have to happen, that I would have to learn the name of another young Black boy who could have been me or my brother or my cousin. And also grappling with this sense of responsibility that I had being a part of the administration, right? Often being on the receiving end of friends who were activists, being very critical and rightfully so of things that we were otherwise responsible for in that moment. And so I remember being extremely sad and extremely angry with the fact that we were invited again to grapple with the vestiges of racism and anti-Blackness and what it means for our babies who are often under attack.
I think that right after Ferguson, there was a moment in this country where I allowed myself to think that white people were gonna care. After Ferguson, during the protests, during the tumult, when news networks were covering it 24/7 like it was a terrorist attack, because it is, because that's how we should think about it. And white people were just kind of learning about the camera phone, and we were having the video of Eric Garner getting choked to death in broad goddamn daylight. Was
Ramsey Orta, he's
Ramsey
the hero,
Orta, right?
The only person punished, and who's a true hero. If it wasn't for him, we would not know about Eric Garner.
He's the guy who took the actual video, and he got punished, not the cop, right? So there was this moment where I thought, that was, as you guys have already said, right after Trayvon, with Obama in office, where I was like, wow, people are gonna care about this. People are gonna do something about this. And that moment has passed. That moment of white people caring has passed. The activism and the energy and the desperation is still there in the Black community, and you see that on the hashtag. You see that when people use the hashtag. You see that when people talk about it. You see that when things go viral. You see the pain and the hurt and the desire to move forward in the Black and brown community all the time. But that moment where white people actually seemed like they were willing to help has passed.
How do you think that Mike Brown as the human was portrayed by the media? And how do you think that the protests themselves in Ferguson were also portrayed?
By whom? And to whom?
Please, you tell me.
Is the first thing, right? So I want to be clear that the way white supremacy works is to make whiteness and white privileging invisible. And so even in asking of the question, I have to be thoughtful about the response is often what does the white media do and how did they tell his story? And Mike Brown, much like Trayvon Martin, much like many other Black people who die without the ability to tell their story or defend what happened in those moments, was blamed for his murder, right? Let's be clear that before Mike Brown's body was covered, let alone taken away, there were already allegations that he smoked weed, the thing that everybody likes to go to, that he was trying to steal or buy cigarillos in order to smoke weed, again, to affirm this idea that that which a lot of white people are now making billions of dollars on is something that is wrong and justifies Black people being killed, right? There were also then conversations about his grades and whether or not he was a stellar, exceptional student who in some way would have then, we should be sad for because it's happened again, not that it's problematic that this has happened and it continues to happen, but again, that he was to be blamed for it. I'm saddened that I think what was often missed are the moments where those stories were, the lies were corrected, right? Very little attention was paid to all of the conversation around the actual footage and what the store owner or the shop owner actually said and what led to that moment. And so what most people know and continue to hold on to is a Black boy who laid in the streets and who no one received justice or answers for as to how we got there or what we do as a result for it.
A report by Race Forward in 2014 found that half of the stories that happened 10 days after Ferguson didn't include the word race. So it was very racist, the media coverage, while also trying to be race blind.
The white media character assassination of Mike Brown has been so complete that as a person who goes online and goes on television and talks about this kind of stuff, if I start talking about just naming people that have been murdered by the cops, or murdered by the society, I can talk about Trayvon Martin, I can talk about Eric Gardner, I can talk about Alton Sterling, I can talk about Philando Castile. If I talk about Mike Brown, white people and some Black people will tell me, well, that's a different case. I mean, he was a thug. He was people will push back on me 5 years on telling me that of the people that I just named, it is Mike Brown who deserved it.
And that's anything to justify the killing of unarmed Black men. And say on the way,
even if he was armed, right? Like this idea that the exceptions are what, and I know you didn't do it right in that regard, but our humanity should matter to the point that there should never be an exception. He's a Black man. There's no excuse for any kind of altercation where two people are met at a particular moment and one of them is murdered and has no ability to talk about what happened, what should have happened or anything.
On the way here, I was looking at the recent event that happened out at the Garlic Festival out in Gilroy. And they dug up this old high school graduation picture of him. And it's always, people acknowledge mental illness when it comes to other races, but they wanted to paint Mike Brown as a thug, to agree with what you said, so people wouldn't feel anything. Right now in New York City, police brutality is ever present. I've been on the front lines, practically assaulted by cops in the last week fighting against police brutality. And the media is trying to portray it that Black people and brown people in some way are kind of provoking these things with the whole water they're showing, the water spraying. But no one talks about chemical agents being sprayed on women and children in the Bronx, in a socioeconomically disadvantaged area. So it's all about going back to the media coverage, which you guys were saying.
And it's also the legal coverage. I mean, one of the things that, so I, because of my website, I read all the police reports. I read all, by the way, just police reports are lies. Police reports are lies. Anyway, so, I read all police reports, read all the court documents, whatever. And one of the things that I can't get over, that it still bothers me, is that Mike Brown was shot 6 times. Forensic evidence suggests that is the 6th shot that killed him. What we should have in this country is a force protocol that requires the officer to justify every shot. You can't just empty your clip at somebody. And when you read Darren Wilson's report, he says he looked like a demon. That's what's in the court document, that the officer who shot him said that Mike Brown looked like a demon as the officer's justification for emptying his clip into the man. We have made him this teen. We have made him into a demon who could only be stopped by an officer emptying his clip into him, and that is not reality.
Which for me is why it's important for us to go back to the nucleus of all of this, and one bullet is one too many. I just think that we have to have more conversations about how we got to this point. I'm thinking in this moment about, we haven't named any Black women. Chiquisha Clemens is a Black woman in Saraland, Alabama, who experienced the beginning stages of rape at the hands of police officers.
What about in Oklahoma?
It was caught on video.
The officer raped 13 Black women. So we're not only talking about, agreeing with what you're saying about sexual assault, but there's also Black women being murdered at a higher rating. Everyone knows the names of Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner. But what about Deborah Danner, who me and my team had to stand in front of the Bronx DA's office in the freezing cold February in New York just to get a grand jury to convene. No one knows these names. Of course, we know Sandra Bland. But there are tons of Black women who are experiencing the same things, not only sexual assault, but also police brutality, and they can't be forgotten.
Based on social media, the people whose names trend are the ones who we understand. They become marked and engraved in our brains, and we talk about them in discussions like this. Do you think that these moments that make social justice issues go viral are the only ones that the great mainstream public think are important? Are these the only people that matter?
I think people are impacted when they see the hashtag. The interesting thing about the hashtag Black Lives Matter, on average, that hashtag is used about 17,000 times per day. And most Black people actually go and look for that hashtag and they believe they're being politically engaged. Now see, that's a tool for me. When I'm promoting an action, that's what I use. I go to social media, I do hashtags, but the only thing, I feel like that's only the first step, the hashtag, because people need to stop being couch revolutionaries. People feel like they've done their civic duty just by hashtagging. They feel that way, and it's not enough. Like, we still need those boots on the ground, those people on the front lines.
Again, I think you gotta ask the whole question, right? So if I hear you saying, does it take a person trending on social media for the white media to care about them and have this conversation? And history heretofore says that the answer is yes. And if they are cis and heterosexual and Black men, that they have a higher likelihood if they are cis, heterosexual, and a Black woman. If the question is, are people impacted by the deaths of Black people in community? The answer is invariably yes, right? So again, 12 women, trans women murdered thus far this year. The year is not over. 6 of them murdered in June, Pride Month. White people and rainbows in every part of this country, while Black people are literally under attack. Black trans people feel it. They feel it every single day when they can't walk outside without worrying about whether or not they're gonna return home safely, right? And for me, this comes back to where Ellie started, which is that, like, often in these moments where the white media deems it important, there is a national conversation about the potential for justice. I was literally driving with Ben Crump because we're working with Nigel Shelby's family. Nigel Shelby, a 15-year-old Black boy who should be right now enjoying his summer, but died by suicide because he was forced to go through toxic spaces, including schools where he was bullied for being both Black and gay, to ensure that he has the potential for justice. This hashtag that we're trying to get people to offer up is so that the white media can deem it important enough to investigate in the court of public opinion. That again is reserved for few people, but when leveraged strategically amongst Black organizers, it's been a tool that we've been able to use for our benefit.
I appreciate virality because from when I wake up in the morning to when I go to bed at night, if I could get through my whole day without seeing dead Black people, I'll do it, right? I'll take that, I will take that option kind of almost every day. So what I appreciate about the virality when it happens is that it forces me even to confront it.
Yeah, Ellie, I hear you acknowledging the privilege that some of us have to not be confronted by this on a daily basis. There are some of us for whom it's not an option to sort of check out. So I'm thankful for this space to be mindful of that. But we need some energy and some love offering. Yeah.
We know that in 2016, Black Lives Matter activists and organizers were very much at the forefront of like pushing politicians to both say that Black Lives Matter, have them explain how police brutality is a part of their platforms, etc. Do you think that both Black Lives Matter as an organization will still be as at the forefront for the 2020 candidates right now?
Absolutely. and especially our chapter, Black Lives Matter, Greater New York, we actually have a political arm called Black Lives Caucus. So say local politicians and some of the people who are running in this whole presidential thing, I've lost track, what is about 23 of these people. somewhere in between there, somewhere in there. They come to us for an endorsement. And honestly, we're getting a little tired of it because people love to throw up the power fist and stand behind our banner and pander the black vote. And as much as the media doesn't want us to know, the black vote is super important and it always has been. And we are a voting bloc. Everyone likes to talk about the Iowa caucus, but South Carolina kind of determines, and that's majority black people, that actually determines who's going to be your Democratic candidate. So as long as they need the black vote, Black Lives Matter is going to kind of be important. But what we're doing at Black Lives Matter Greater New York is we're having our own candidates. We're tired of people pandering, and you don't know how many promises we received. And you know how many times I've stood on the stage after helping people get elected and they refuse to mention Black Lives Matter, or people who stalk us down the whole campaign trail and you can't even get a retweet. So I'm actually running for Congress because I'm going to affect some real change. And I feel like my people, black and brown people, we're never going to have justice unless we have real power.
And you ask people to offer a specific policy about police brutality, they say like, we're gonna have a conversation, and community policing is super important. Like, that's all they got. All they've got are policies that are designed not to piss off cops. And I am of the opinion that you are not gonna fix this problem unless you are willing to piss off cops. And they're of the opinion that you cannot get elected unless you don't piss off cops. So there's a fundamental tension there. But it really comes down to the local level, because as much as I am happy to stay with my foot up the behinds of all the presidential candidates, when it comes right down to it in our system of government, because it's a federated system, the president doesn't have a lot of power. The attorney general doesn't have a lot of power to affect policing and therefore police brutality on the ground. They can set a tone, as I think Obama did, a positive tone. They can set a negative tone, as I think Donald Trump does. But in terms of like actual changes, it's their scope of power is very limited. We have to remember, I don't mean to dog Obama here, let's not forget that Michael Brown was shot during the Obama administration, and that Michael Brown's murder was investigated by the Loretta Lynch DOJ, and they did not bring charges against the people in St. Louis who shot him. So the president has a limited scope of power here, but governors, mayors, these are city council members, these are the people that can bring the police to heel. And if we are not voting up and down the ticket, state, local, and federal down the ticket for people who will affect real change, then we're not gonna get change on this issue.
It all matters, right? Like, we don't sadly have the luxury of the either or, right? The tyranny in that we have to think about both ends. And so it's really important for us to have more conversations about the fact that all politics is local, that we as a community have to do a better job of engaging every election, every time. But federal policy also matters, right? It is significant, and we should all be mindful of the fact that having a person who has the election certificate, who can command the media, be able to send dog signals to white supremacists and racists, matters when you also have people who are governors and local elected officials who are abdicating their responsibility to ensure that policies protect all citizens. The Movement for Black Lives offered up a policy agenda that responded to the lack of the ability for white elected officials to be able to think creatively about what we need. The legacy of that still is showing up in candidates and their platforms today. So if you read Pete Buttigieg's plan, his Douglas plan, that is his mentioning what he would do to respond to all of the critiques and criticisms of Black people, the connections between what's in that document and what the Movement for Black Lives offered up is palpable. And so we should celebrate that with regard to people running for office at every level, and people being more mindful of the importance of and what it means to develop policies that are codified and endure at every level. We have much more work to do.
I mean, you don't get what Cory Booker is proposing with his Next Step program. You don't get what Julian Castro is proposing with his criminal justice reform program without Black Lives Matter. It just doesn't happen.
So within the last 5 years, from Ferguson to now, how do you think that the relationship between Black people and policing has changed? Or has it at all?
It is legal to murder Black people in this country if you were a cop. And I have known that since I was a teen because my parents had to tell me that. I think many African Americans have known that from a very early age. White people have only figured that out in the past 5 years. Some of them. But scary thing is that now they know that they can get away with it, right?
They weaponize it.
And they've weaponized it. So it is, it certainly is worse in my lifetime, the relationship between people of color and the police. Because the citizens that the police speak for, now understand better than ever before that they can silence me, scare me, brutalize my family with their cell phone, simply by calling their attack dogs in the police force to come get me from the Starbucks or the Haagen-Dazs or wherever I happen to be minding my own business.
Or the sidewalk. And I think also at the risk of being persnickety, the thing that has also happened is that it shifted the conversation away from the reality that there's a Mike Brown in every city because cities are designed for this reason, right? The thing that often gets missed is, why is it that young, Black in particular, kids are outside in the streets in Florissant in the summer? Because it's hot as hell and there's nowhere for them to go. Because they've closed recreation facilities. It took the Urban League opening a new facility after Mike Brown was murdered in memorial to him, 3 blocks away from where he was murdered in the street. The schools weren't operating after-school programs. There are no Big Brothers programs that come in to save the day whenever they want a presidential photo op that were embedded in that community. And that's by design, right? There are policies that make it difficult for Black people to access educational and workforce development programs, that make it so that there are not opportunities for them to learn and grow over the summer. And we are now no longer having that conversation because we then get caught up in the, well, Black people need to respect police more or buy into it. We need to have more conversations around the politics of respectability. And police are saying, well, if they didn't do the things that we said justified forced enslavement, then we wouldn't be in this predicament. And that's a never-ending circular cycle. And so the thing that, again, for me is most dangerous is that the mental health needs, the lack of access to social services, the poor quality of public education still exist in Florissant as it did before Mike Brown was murdered, and we don't even talk about it.
Stats show that Black people are disproportionately killed by police and that cops are almost never prosecuted and convicted for deadly use of force. And because of that, there are so many Black people who have just lost faith in the system, you know? So what does justice look like and what can it look like outside of indictments and convictions? And honestly, what would it even take for an indictment?
No. I refuse to cede that ground. Justice looks like indictments and convictions. And what we need to have that happen is to reform our criminal justice system. And it starts with elections, it starts with voting, it starts with voting in better, different prosecutors. To me, the most important thing that came out of Ferguson, that came out of Mike Brown, was that Bob McCullough, the prosecutor who refused to do his job and refused to prosecute Darren Wilson, the police officer, lost his job and was replaced by Wesley Bell, who is a former criminal defense attorney, a former activist, and is now sitting in the prosecutor's office. And we have faith that if a situation like this would arise again, that he will prosecute cops. So we need a whole new class of prosecutors in our cities that look like us, that listen to us, that were voted into office by us, who are willing to hold these police officers to account. And so I'm not willing to see the ground that there's some other way to get justice outside of the legal process. No, justice is indicting, convicting, and holding these people accountable.
When we talk about this system that we're living in, this white supremacist structure, how do we achieve Black liberation within all of these confines?
Yeah, I live in Wakanda, and for me that means acknowledging that while I have to respond to systems that white people control, so much of what I expend my energy focused on and why I do the work that I do, literally standing at the intersections of purpose and passion is controlled by and directed to Black people, right? I lead a civil rights organization that acknowledges that as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black LGBTQIA, and I use the term same gender loving because gay is a white political identifier. And sometimes it's important to make that connection, but I care about Black people being able to hold more space for all of us to be able to be free. And so it is seldom the case that unless we're having conversations like this, or I'm invited to leverage the credentials from Columbia University or the master's tools that I have to dismantle that house, I often spend time talking with Black people about holding more space for us. And I wrote about how it is impossible to be pro-Black and not be pro-Black feminist, pro-Black LGBTQIA, disability, non-native immigrant, and all these things. And there are Black people who are having a hard time swallowing that pill. And for me, if we can get us to understand how the sign systems and symbols support white people and our oppression, and shift us so we can use language better and more affirming ways to hold space to care when other people that don't look like us or don't have access to our privilege, our communities. If I can get Black people to do better holding up and holding space for us, then I don't really care what white people do.
Shavonna, do you think that it's possible to enact social change working within this system? Or do you think that specifically when we're discussing police brutality, we need to completely abolish policing?
I do not believe in completely abolishing policing. I believe in police reform. I believe that the cops shouldn't get a pass for killing my Black, brown, trans, no matter what, one of my people. I think we definitely need policing reform. We need to demilitarize the police. We need to hold police accountable. And I think that's the way to move forward. But I feel like we definitely still need policing. They just need better training. They need training to stop incidents like Deborah Danner. They need to learn how to handle people with mental health issues. Maybe going back to what you were saying in terms of people who look like you, and I totally, it's cliche, but representation matters. Maybe if we had police who look like us, like maybe if police learned just how to treat a Black person with respect, and maybe as an equal, as another human being, we can move forward. But no, we definitely still need police.
Why do we still need police? All of what you said was standing why.
We need police because there's still gonna be crime. Like, I'm sorry, like I'm optimistic, but some people do need to be punished. Now, do we need to change rehabilitation? Do we need to get rid of things like closed Rikers and cash bail, and we shouldn't criminalize poverty? But yes, we still need police.
I heard you say some people need to be punished and there will still be crime. And I would just offer up to your question about what does it look like? There were periods in our history where we might have done something that looks like community policing, where we address that. I don't know. No, it was a genuine question about what does it look like? No, I would offer up that possibly community policing. It looks like responding to the issues that lead to mental health crises that show up in people committing crimes. I just acknowledge again, and for me, a lot of this, I'm in a PhD program studying sociology, and invariably by definition, when people come into community, there's gonna be stratification. There's going to be crime by people defining that the way to show up is to do X, Y, and Z. That's how we get to conversations about the politics of respectability. I just have a hard time appreciating all of what you said to be true because I agree with it and still saying we need police. Because again, I imagine for the things that you offered up, there are ways for us to respond to them.
In my house or in my neighborhood, I want to be able to call the cops. I'm sorry, I want to be able to call NYPD without fear of being treated. I would too in theory, except to go back
to where we are, they get operationalized. I know that if I call the cops, they're not coming to protect me.
I know that
even
too.
in moments when I need it, which leads me to say that it might not look like that.
We can't throw out the whole system. We just need to design it to serve all people. Well, you got to break it down for me.
It makes us uncomfortable.
You got to break it down for me.
It makes us uncomfortable, but we could do it.
In my as we've already talked, my privileged little suburban community.
I'm coming up.
So I'm home late at night. I live with my wife. I got my 2 kids. I got my mom. I got my dog. She's not a good guard dog. And you hear something outside, and it was scary. I was worried about what it was, and I tried to do everything I could to not call the cops. I had a flashlight, I had a searchlight, I had I'm not a gun person, so I have no guns, but I had, by my baseball bat and my flashlight, and I was doing everything I could to avoid calling the cops for this thing that my white neighbor would have called the cops on immediately. My my Asian neighbor across the street would have called the cops on immediately. There was rattling at my garage door. That was clearly not an animal. Like something was happening, right?
You should be able to call without fear of being harmed.
Right. So my problem with kind of both of your issues is that I need to be able to call the cops in that moment. Right?
However, keep going.
But I can't, right? So the system of policing that we have is clearly not working for me and for my community. It's clearly working for a lot of white people who live in my community. I don't want police unless I can have the white police.
And when we think about that as our reality, right? That we should be able to call them. There are moments where we definitely want to call them because who else are we going to call? The lack of an option. It's heartbreaking, but I don't want us to feel like we have to succumb to accepting that which has been because we don't want to imagine what could otherwise be.
I'm hearing that we have to dismantle white supremacy as the solution. Is that realistic?
Yes, hell yes. Black women have taught us that for heretofore, right? Like again, some of this is about calling a thing and naming white supremacy and be willing to continue to say it even when it might cost you your job. are relationships in particular spaces. Black feminists a long time ago, they named it the matrix of domination, signs, systems, and symbols that make all of this stuff work. It's how these institutions function. Public systems of education work just like public systems of incarceration, right? There are policies that operationalize them. There are people that are then empowered. If we start by naming them as we're doing, then identifying and changing the policies, helping people to increase their cultural competence, to level up so that they can shift their practices, we can do something different going forward.
What message do we have for people so that they can keep hope alive?
Get engaged. Because the most powerful thing, and we had talked about it earlier with hashtagging, but when you're out on the front lines and you're fighting for justice, you feel like where he's from, you feel like Wakanda, you feel like a superhero. So I would just encourage everyone to be active, show up, not make a whole career out of it. I would love if you would. Come on, come please join me. Like we have a youth coalition that's happening in schools around New York City. Our actual president's a 19-year-old who attends Hampton University, but get involved. Like, get off the couch, get out of your house, and come out and do it. That's the way we affect change.
For self-care, as having talked earlier about how I have the privilege of opting out when I want to opt out, is that I encourage people to read their history. I am also privileged and blessed that my mother, who lives with me, was born in 1950 in Mississippi, right? So she was born in the segregated South, and she's there for me to remind me of how far we've already come, of how hard the struggle has already been, and how she's still alive, and I'm still alive, and my kids are still alive, right? I find that understanding our own history, we were talking earlier, we both have Haitian descent, reading more about the Haitian Revolution, we are part of a generational story. And I think one of the things that white supremacy has always done to us is to cut us off from our past, to make us feel like we're islands, that we're out here alone, like we're the first person to have seen what we're seeing. We're not. We're not. We have a long, beautiful Black history, all of us do. And if we can kind of remember the struggle that has come before us, I think that gives us strength to go forward.
And that is often for me a message for the elders, right? I'm not going to define what that means, but I find joy in knowing that God purposed for me to be an educator, right? And spending so much time with young people who are beyond woke. Right, again, I remind people, James Baldwin talked about being relatively conscious, and Black in America is almost always to be in a constant state of rage 5 decades ago almost. But the young people I meet, they know this intuitively, even if they don't have the language or they can't name the leaders. They know that we are people who have always been resilient in spite of. They know that white people are mad because we show up and show out, right? They know that we are incredibly diverse, and they are pushing even when we get in the way. And so my hope is that we are reminded of what's possible, that we draw strength from our ancestors who continue to show up and be there for us when we need them to. And if we are unable to support young people, we simply move out of their way.
Amen. And to that, I say thank you so much for joining me. This was an intense conversation, but it was necessary. And honestly, I hope that all the viewers will be able to take something from it, because I know that I will.